They say seeing is believing, but you can't see the mind. So, should you believe that it exists? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the movie Mystery Men. I kind of saw it a long time ago, so there's very little that I remember about it, but I do remember one part that I thought was very clever was, I think his name was Invisible Boy. It was Kel from Kenan and Kel, and his superpower was that he was invisible when you didn't look at him. Well, I also remember that they didn't actually believe that he turned invisible because, obviously you could never see it happening. And in general, it seems like claims about things that we can't observe seem suspect. But isn't that what the mind is? Now, we've been considering the mind-body problem, which is the question of, do I have a mind that is distinct from my brain? And really, it's an argument about the kinds of things that we should believe. So this is the argument from extreme empiricism. Number one, we should only believe in things that we can observe. Number two, the mind is in no way observable. So number three, we shouldn't believe in the mind. Now, before we move on, note that we may want to make premise one a little bit stronger. So for example, there are wavelengths of light that we can't observe ever. Ultraviolet and infrared. The way premise one reads right now, since we can never observe them, we should never believe that they exist, or we should at least refrain from belief that they exist. So we might want to make some amendments to premise one. We might want to say that we should believe in things that are observable in principle. Maybe if we had a perfect observer that had all the right sensory organs, or maybe we want to add a clause that says something like, even if we can't observe it, at least we can build machines that can observe it. In any case, if we're going to strengthen premise one like that, then we might have a problem with premise two. In the original form, well, it's obvious that we don't perceive people's minds, but its new strengthened premise one makes premise two a little bit harder to prove. We would have to show not only that we don't happen to see people's minds, but that in principle we couldn't, or that we couldn't build machines that could detect them. Is there a way to argue for this more strengthened premise two? Well, one thing we could say is that all perception requires physicality. Perception requires things like sensory organs, thing out there to be sensed, and possibly a medium for things like photons to go through. And all of these things are physical. So we might want to conclude that therefore no non-physical thing can be observed. But then again, that argument assumes that all perception has to be like the perception that we have. I don't know, maybe there's some kind of non-physical perception out there. It could be totally different from the kind of observation that we have. We just don't have any reason to say that that's impossible. So if our argument is that it's impossible to perceive a non-physical thing, although I have a hard time seeing, how this kind of thing would be possible, at the very least, I guess we'd have to say that it would beg the question to say that all observation has to be like our observation. A second argument I think is a little bit stronger. We've been considering the mind and psychological states, and one of the marquee aspects of these things is that they are first person. What do I mean by first person? Well, you could consider like that first person shooter games, where it looks like you're looking through the eyes of the person, versus like all the third person games where you're just sort of controlling a guy that's jumping around. First person is from your perspective. Well, only you can look through your own mind. It's impossible for anybody else to see through your mind. So it seems like the fact that the mind is first person means that nobody could observe it. Now, the example of a first person video game might give you the idea of a possible counterexample. Imagine one day we have a camera that can observe everything that's happening inside of the brain, all the structure and all the activity. It then sends data to a computer that interprets all that data into what the person is seeing, then projects it on a screen. We could call it mind vision. And if we had this mind vision technology, wouldn't we be seeing into the mind of the person? I don't think we would, for the following reason, and I'm actually going to give you something that is going to seem like I'm trying to prove one thing, and I'm really just using it to prove a different thing. How do we know that what the mind vision is projecting out there is what that person is actually seeing? I'm not saying this to doubt that it would be, but just think about that. If we had a normal camera, then we take a picture of a thing, I can actually look at the thing, compare it to the image that I just took, and I can say, yeah, it looks like these things match up. There's some things that we can't see though with the naked eye. So if I'm trying to look through like a microscope or a telescope, let's take the example of an electron microscope. I'm not actually observing anything that the microscope is observing. Really what's happening is I'm shooting electrons through something very thin and I'm getting some image that comes out the other side. But at least I've got something similar to the idea of photons hitting something, reflecting it back onto my eyes, you could imagine how the electrons would be affected in the same way, and for that reason we might trust what that image is. But how do I compare what's being projected from the mind vision to the thing that's happening in that person's mind? It's not like taking the picture where I can look at the actual thing and see if the two actually measure up. It's not even like the electron microscope where I'm bouncing things through the mind and I'm getting some kind of image coming out the other side. Really, there's nothing about that person's mind that is being projected on the screen. And this is because the mind vision isn't recording the mind, it's recording the brain. The mind is in no way being observed either by ourselves or by the mind vision camera either. Instead, what we're seeing is some kind of interpretation of what the brain is doing by the mind vision. And granted, the person can look at that screen and say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm seeing, but in no case are we actually observing that person's mind. We're just getting confirmation from that person. Again, I'm not using this to prove that the mind vision doesn't work. I'm using this to show that there's no observation happening from ourselves or our machines. Now, you may wonder, what about the person that's looking at the mind vision and confirming that that's what they're seeing? Aren't they observing their own mind? And in fact, I think this presents a second objection that's much more successful. The extreme empiricism idea is something like this. The things of the mind are psychological states. Harold feels pain, Grandma sees the internet, Deborah thinks about her boyfriend. Now, the psychological states of others are not observable. The only things that really are observable are the behaviors of others or the brains of others. We observe Harold wincing, we observe Grandma moving her eyes, we observe Deborah making a sour face. Of course, we could also cut the top of the head open, peek inside and see that there's a brain that's working. So it seems plausible that we can conclude these things that we see, behaviors and brains, those things exist, but I'm looking in there, I don't see a mind anywhere, so that can't exist. The problem is, this is only a plausible idea when I'm considering the minds of others. And in fact, in philosophy, this is a notorious problem, the problem of other minds. How do I know that everybody in here isn't just a flesh and blood robot? How do I know that you're actually having perceptions, you're actually having an inner mental life, instead of just being programmed to act like you are? So of course we can't observe the minds of others. However, when I consider myself, seems like the reverse is the case. I do seem to observe my own psychological states. I have first-person observation of my own pain. Obviously not visual observation, but it's undoubtedly an observed psychological state. I have a first-hand observation of my own visual experience. In fact, observation itself just is visual experience. I have firsthand observed my own thoughts. In fact, I'm thinking about them right now. Now, that's not to say that I have perfect access to my thoughts. I'm not always aware of my thoughts. For example, I don't know that you have ever had anesthesia, but they put you under and you talk and you say weird stuff and you're thinking there, but you're not aware of anything that you're doing. It's really weird. And then sometimes you all of a sudden come to and you're thinking like, wait, what am I talking about? It's bizarre. Also, I can convince myself that the contents of my thoughts are other than they are. For example, I might have a prejudiced thought and I might convince myself that it's for very good reasons when really it's just because of some kind of racism or sexism or something like that. So I don't have perfect access to my thoughts, but at the very least I'm aware that there are thoughts. So it seems like there is an observation of a mind, observation of my own mind. And in fact, the observation of my own body and brain only comes through these psychological states. How do I know that I have a brain? Well, I could only observe my brain through the visual experience of my brain and possibly some mirrors. How do I know that I have a body and behaviors? Well, I have to observe them through my visual experience. So it's only through being in a psychological state that I observe my own body, brain, and behaviors. In fact, it's only through being in a psychological state that I observe anybody's body, brains, or behaviors. So even though I can't observe the minds of others, the only way that I could observe any part of them is through my own mind. Now, one possible response to this is that sure, this is an observation, but it's not an observation that's shared with anybody else. We need an observation where lots of people can see it so that we can check for its veracity. Science, for example, only proceeds by believing things that can be observed by other people. But we just said that nobody else can see into your mind. However, I don't think that this response would work here, and here's why. As scientists, we only care about other people verifying our observations because sometimes our observations can be misleading. We may see a mirage or we may misread data. What's not in doubt, however, is that the observation itself exists. That we can be sure about because we're looking at it right now. So the criterion of having other people check our work doesn't seem to really apply here. And in fact, in order to get that verification from other people, we have to rely on our own experiences. We have to see them nodding, yes, that's what I observe as well, or shaking their heads, no. You have a perceptual experience of those people, and that's what you're trusting. So the only way that you can have agreement from others is if you do assume that you're having this experience. And not only that, you also have to assume that they themselves are also having experiences so that they can observe. The final possible response that people give sometimes is to go totally for broke and say, okay, it seems like you're having visual experience of stuff. It seems like you're feeling pain. It seems like all these things are happening in your mind, but it's all an illusion. It only appears like you're in a psychological state. And sometimes they'll give examples of things that might make us question our judgment about these perceptions. The most interesting, I think, is the phantom limb idea. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but some people who lose a limb report years later feeling pain in that limb that no longer exists. I don't mean like wherever it is. I mean like where it used to be on their body. They'll feel like a pain in their hand, but their hand isn't there. So they'll want to rub their hand, but there's nothing to rub. So you might think, well, look, you think that you're having a pain in your hand. You think that you're experiencing that, but obviously you're not because you don't have a hand. The problem with this response is that an illusion just is an experience. It just is a psychological state. So if you tell me I'm not having a psychological state, I'm having an illusion, you're saying I'm not having a psychological state, I'm having a psychological state. Worse, an illusion is a psychological state with no physical reality associated with it. I mean, think about that phantom limb idea. It actually proves the point. There are no nerves there. There are no behaviors of hands clenching and unclenching. And yet you feel something that's sitting out there. By the way, I'm not saying that this proves like you have a ghost hand or something like that. I'm saying that it shows that you're having some kind of experience, an experience of pain. So far from solving anything, saying that a psychological state is an illusion is just making things worse. And in fact, you're not going to hear me taking a definite stand on too many things. On this show, I typically am going to argue for both sides the best that I can. And yet this is one place where I can't see how you could deny that you're having a psychological state. Really, I kind of agree with Rene Descartes, which is probably a first. You're not sure that any physical thing exists. You have dreams that you think are real. You could be in a dream right now. You're looking around, and I'm not saying that you should believe that, right? I'm just saying that it's a possibility. You look around at all this physical stuff in a dream, none of these physical things exist. So you're not sure that any of these things exist right now. In a dream, your body isn't even real. I've had dreams where I was in somebody else's body before, but even if I'm in my own body, I'm dreaming that my body's doing all kinds of stuff, but my physical body isn't doing those things. I'd be smacking myself in the face if it were. So in a dream, all the physical stuff out there is not real. But the only thing that you can be sure about is the experience of these things. Even if this is all a dream, at the very least, the dream exists. And if it isn't a dream, then the perceptual experience exists. Either way, there's some kind of psychological state there that exists. Which brings us to an interesting place. I can't really doubt that I'm having a sense experience right now, that I'm having thoughts right now. But then again, psychological states are non-physical things. I see a surfboard back here, but my brain doesn't turn into a surfboard. You can't open my brain and look at, oh, there it is. Look at that thought running around there. It's a surfboard thought. No, it seems like our thoughts aren't the same things as our neurons. And yet, if they're real, then we have something that exists that's non-physical. Now, what exactly that's like? Is it some kind of ghostly soul out there? Is it just some mind? Are these thoughts non-physical properties of the neurons themselves? That's an interesting question that we'll get into in later videos. But if you have any questions about this, please let me know in the comments. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And that's all I got for today. Adios.